Welcome back to another episode of L Podcast. Today's guest is Seamus Bruner, the Director of Research at the Government Accountability Institute, and is the author of the new book, Controligarchs, Exposing a Billionaire Class, Their Secret Deals, and the Globalist Plot to Dominate Your Life, which is today's topic. Thank you so much, Seamus, for joining us today.
Jesse, it's a pleasure.
So let's just start with the name of your book, since it's called Controligarchs. Can you explain what a Controligarch is and what makes a Controligarch?
Sure. Very simply, it's an oligarch, which is a fabulously wealthy individual with very close ties to the government who wants to control your life. So in Russia, they have oligarchs. A lot of corrupt countries have what's known as oligarchs. They're the multi-gazillionaires who own a lot of the industries. The difference between the Controligarchs and your typical Russian, let's say, oligarch is that these guys want to control your life. You know, most of the oligarchs in Russia, they're kind of just getting rich and on yachts and eating caviar. But these guys, men like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, George Soros, they have taken great steps to cornering every market from food and agriculture to energy, health, transportation, financial sector, basically every sector that dominates our life. They have put a noose around it, and they are just a couple years away from total world domination.
In your book, you write, quote, "The Gates business model works like this. Bill Gates personally invests his money in some new venture. Then his foundation pours millions or even billions into ensuring that his venture takes off. Occasionally, he funnels his personal profits back into his foundation and calls it charity while taking sizable tax refunds. It is hardly a unique business model. The Rockefellers, George Soros, Warren Buffett, and other big billionaires do the same thing. Gates' giving pledge is one legal tax avoidance scheme with the added benefit of buying good publicity." End of your quote. How do billionaires, including Bill Gates, utilize their nonprofit trust, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to enrich themselves? And what ways does this strategy enable them to wield influence?
Certainly. So the book starts out with the Rockefeller family, who I call the Controligarch prototype. And the Rockefellers were famous for discovering tons of uses of petroleum, setting up Standard Oil, which of course famously became a trust and a monopoly that the Department of Justice broke up in the early 1900s. And at the same time that the Justice Department was looking into Rockefeller and all of his kind of shady business tactics and anti-competitive business tactics, that's when the Rockefeller Foundation was born. Right at the same time, he was making so much money. He had this advisor who told him, if you don't start spending your money, it's going to crush you like an avalanche. And so it's around this time that, and by the way, the press, the New York Times, everybody was running all these negative stories on the Rockefellers and how greedy and anti-competitive they were. So when the Rockefeller Foundation was born, it served as this benefit of both working as a tax write-off system where you donate to yourself and then you get to use this foundation. But it also was this great publicity scheme where all of a sudden they went from these cutthroat monopolists to the world's greatest philanthropists. And they're just, putting socks on orphans in Africa, shoeless orphans, and you're curing all these diseases. Of course, they didn't cure that many. They found treatments for diseases, which became very profitable. And so the foundation for the Rockefellers, it was a medical foundation. They would go and claim to be curing all of these things. They would actually got into the agriculture sector in the mid-1900s. So they would use the nonprofit tax-exempt organization to get the tax write-offs, but then they would invest in the private sector in a lot of the industries, whether it was the healthcare industry or the agriculture industry. And so they actually end up making more money. Bill Gates adopted that model. I talk about it all throughout the book, how he used the Rockefellers as this prototype. Bill Gates of the 80s and 90s was this cutthroat tech guy, monopolist, antitrust division of DOJ started looking into him. It's a strikingly similar story to the Rockefellers. He never liked philanthropy. He never liked charity. His mother pleaded with him right up until on her deathbed to please be more charitable. And he was not a guy who would give money away. Then the Department of Justice starts looking into Microsoft for its anti-competitive strategies. And that's when he sets up the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and sort of rebrands himself and becomes this darling of the left. I mean, the left, who would have seen him as this ruthless capitalist pig who's not paying his fair share, all of a sudden he starts giving away money to causes that the left seems to love. And that's when he becomes sort of Bill Gates, the savior of the world. He's trying to save the planet and fix climate change and cure starvation. Well, here's how the business model works. So Microsoft had this strategy called Embrace, Extend, Extinguish, or Embrace, Extend, Exterminate, as it was sometimes called by the Microsoft executives, whereby they would enter a market, that was the embrace phase, and they would kind of embrace the standards of the day and act like, oh, we're not here to disrupt anything. They would extend their reach throughout that market. And the Justice Department identified the internet browser market, where all of a sudden Internet Explorer pops up. Now it's on everybody's PC, but there's competitors at the time, Netscape. Well, then Microsoft pushes to change the standards that would all of a sudden, in the words of a Microsoft executive, quote, cut off the air supply to, end quote, Netscape. Okay, so that embrace, extend, extinguish strategy has been adopted by Bill Gates, and this is where the foundation business model comes into play. A lot of people have heard Bill Gates is investing in farmland and, oh, what's he up to? He's investing in these fake meat companies like Beyond Meats and Impossible Burgers. But what's he doing with all this? Well, he's using the embrace, extend, extinguish strategy, where he first embraces and enters the agriculture space. Then he extends his reach, buys up more and more land, more and more investments in food companies. Some people have heard of Apeel, and he's in the Ginkgo Bioworks, which is a synthetic fertilizer company. He's got all these investments in the food and agriculture sector. Here's where the extinguish phase comes in, and where the foundation plays a role is the foundation puts out research about how cow flatulence is the worst leading cause of climate change, and is, our top 5 leading causes of climate change. And we've got to ban the cows. We've got to ban the fertilizers. We've got to ban all of these techniques that farmers have been using for generations. In the family-owned farms, they can't keep up. This is the extinguish phase, where all of a sudden the competition has to go away, and they can't afford the regulations. So when people like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez get out there in front of the cameras and they say that cow flatulence is this huge problem, she didn't just dream it up. She's not quite that creative. That comes from a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So Bill Gates pours money into his foundation, gets the tax write-off, uses that money to fund research that then furthers his personal investments. And so it's this cycle. We actually track down every dollar that Bill Gates has ever earned, put it all into spreadsheets. And it turns out we found that for every dollar he gives away to quote unquote charity, which is really just his own foundation for his own influence schemes, he gets $2 in return. So is it really charity? I mean, he's almost doubled up in the last just couple of years.
It's charity to himself. That's all it is. In your book, Controligarchs, you focus mainly on Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, George Soros, Warren Buffett, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the World Economic Forum, or WEF. Which of these Controligarchs has the most influence?
It's always such a tough question. I mean, I've got Bill Gates front and center. I mean, he's really dominated, like out of nowhere, the entire global health industry. Anthony Fauci takes his orders from Gates, not the other way around. And so like the global health industry, I mean, now he's in food and agriculture. Of course, he's in tech. I mean, Microsoft just completed one of the largest mergers and acquisitions in history, taking over Activision, which is really playing into their sort of metaverse, AI, transhumanist future visions. Microsoft has got HoloLens, which is going to be a competitor to Oculus. And so he's moving into not just software and computing, but also video gaming space, the virtual reality space. And then, in everything. He's invested a lot of big pharmaceutical companies. So he's got a lot of influence. There's a great piece that Bloomberg News published when Joe Biden was trying to pass the Inflation Reduction Act, that Senator Joe Manchin in West Virginia was like this lone holdout vote. Otherwise, the Democrats could have forced it through. But Manchin wanted some things in return. The Democrats, Chuck Schumer, couldn't get Joe Manchin to play ball. Bill Gates picks up the phone, calls Senator Manchin and says, listen, we'll get you what you need. You need to vote yes on the Inflation Reduction Act. Why does Bill Gates want the Inflation Reduction Act? It has a $400 billion slush fund for green energy technologies. That's another sector he's really heavily involved in. I mean, he's got this nuclear power company, TerraPower. So I would put Bill Gates, he's just in everything. But I also, of course, George Soros has got to be on the list. I mean, he's creating chaos in our cities by funding these radical prosecutors who are just trying to make crime legal. Then, of course, his involvement in our open border situation, that makes him pretty dangerous. And there was some uncertainty whether George Soros would even last until the book was published back when we started this investigation 2 years ago. So rather than all the kind of rehashed stories of what George Soros has done, we really followed what his children are up to, because he's got 5 children. Alexander Soros is the most prominent among them. He's also the youngest of George Soros's children. And so Alexander Soros is actually a lot more radical than his father. And if he lives to the age of George, he'll be influencing elections and funding abortion type right issues for the next 50 years. And that's if America survives these Controligarchs' efforts to destroy us. But I think Klaus Schwab, I always land on him because he's really the figurehead and the kind of front man for all of them. And what the World Economic Forum, I mean, he's kind of this sequious, academic, nerdy type guy. And yeah, he kind of sounds like a Bond villain parody or something with this thick German accent. So it's hard to take him seriously sometimes. But everything he's doing is very serious. It's not funny. And the World Economic Forum is kind of this umbrella organization for all of the Controligarchs.
In your book, you said that Alex Soros was born in 1985, and it's younger than I am. So he will be around
and he's now sitting atop the $25 billion dark money empire. He's the new kingpin of like dark money in politics, and he's more radical than his father. So Alex Soros, that's certainly you got to read what he's up to.
You also mentioned in your book Laurene Powell Jobs, who is the widow of Steve Jobs, and you mentioned that she's become a major financier of left-wing causes since her husband Steve Jobs passed away in 2011. And you even mentioned that some people nicknamed her the new Soros. Until reading your book, I never even heard of Powell Jobs. Who are some of these lesser-known billionaires that also have a lot of influence?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Laurene Powell Jobs. And I wish I could have devoted like entire chapters to her. She's very secretive. She doesn't really like to publicize what she's up to. She's very big in the disinformation censorship space and funding these sort of like Aspen Institute conferences where they go and meet up with FBI and DOJ folks and figure out how to like label Americans domestic terrorists or something. She's bought up a ton of media outlets. She owns the Atlantic, which is kind of like the leader. I mean, it's even before, it's like the thought leader of the globalist press, like the New York Times and Washington Post, of course, are right up there too. But the Atlantic, like when the Atlantic writes something, first of all, you'll probably like just want to tear it up in frustration at how disinformative it is, to use one of their terms. It's more or less a propaganda outlet. But ever since Laurene Powell Jobs took it over, it's gotten a lot worse. She also set up this like acronym organization that was heavily involved in setting up all these little, like they claim to be grassroots local papers type thing, like local news online websites, but it's basically just a giant network of fake news during the election to spread, saying like whether it's Trump is a Russian agent, or think of any of the past fake news hoaxes that we've heard of over the past 6 to 10 years. I mean, there's a lot. So she kind of would peddle that stuff out and push it far and wide. Some of the lesser knowns, let's see, Mark Benioff, he's one of these tech guys who's been at a bunch of the various companies, and he uses a lot of his money. Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, he's one of these guys who's really funding disinformation initiatives. Piero Midyar. And when I say a disinformation initiative, I mean, just hear that as censorship initiatives, ways to label the truth as fake news or disinformation or misinformation or malinformation or hate speech, et cetera. All of these new terms that we've heard pop up in the last few years that really amount to censorship. Piero Midyar, he was an eBay co-founder. He set up The Intercept. He's got a $550 million combined effort to stifle free speech. Ted Turner's one of the old school Controligarchs. He's really concerned in the overpopulation space and thinks that the entire world needs to adopt a one-child policy like China. He actually suggested that poor people could, in the future, if they wanted to make a buck, could sell their fertility rights. So if there's a one-child policy, all the rich people could just have 5 children by buying the fertility rights of poor people. That's something he seriously suggested. He thinks that the ideal global population is somewhere between 250 million or up to 2. I mean, he's kind of walked that back. Obviously, that sounds extreme. What are you going to do with 7.75 billion people? But right up to 2 billion is what he thinks the maximum population of the planet should be. And a lot of these guys are like that. They're these overpopulation, Malthusian people who think that there should be less people on planet Earth. They never really tell you how they want to get there. I don't allege anything crazy like there's some sort of secret genocide or whatever going on. But at the same time, how do they plan to get there? Bill Gates said that by working on global health problems, we can actually lower the birth rates. It's kind of counterintuitive. I guess, I really don't understand the data he presents where he says if more children live to adulthood, then people will have less children. So effectively, if people in Africa have 5 children because they're not sure if they're going to lose 2 or 3 of them, I haven't seen any persuasive data that if they have 5 children, I mean, usually you have a lot of children to help out with the family business, help out with the family farm, et cetera. So it's not like because the children are dying. Anyway, so that's a whole thing that's explored in the book is like, how do you save, how do you, if you think the earth is overpopulated, why does saving lives fix that? And sort of get into some of the ways that they think that works. It doesn't seem to be working.
Outside of Elon Musk, it seems like all the rest of the Controligarchs are all in favor of a reduced population.
Completely. And I do give Elon Musk credit in the book for that. I mean, he's one of the very few voices out there saying that, no, the earth is not overpopulated. We found multiple studies that showed if the global population lived as densely as people in Manhattan or Chicago do, the entire global population could live in New Zealand. Now, of course, you wouldn't want to have 8 billion people in high rises across a small island, but people like that are living by the tens of millions in big cities all around the world. That would leave the entire rest of the planet totally vacant. We obviously don't have a water problem. And the one thing that these kind of overpopulation folks always fail to account for is the one resource of all. They all say that, oh, we're going to exhaust the Earth's resources. They never account for the resource known as human ingenuity. We always find a way to adapt and overcome shortages of different kinds. There was a big fear back in the 1700s and 1800s that we were going to run out of timber because the shipping industry was just booming and then the ships were killing all the trees and whatever. Well, then they devised steel ships, and there you go. Like, it's a better quality of a ship. And then now we have fiberglass boats. So once the resource becomes expensive enough, people find ways to adapt and make a better product that turns out the resource you never ran out of wood like they were fear-mongering a couple hundred years ago.
In your book, Controligarchs, you write that in 1983, 50 companies owned 90% of the U.S. media, and now 6 companies control almost the entire media sector. Then if you add in Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, essentially 11 companies control nearly all the traditional and non-traditional media outlets, which means that the Controligarchs essentially shape the narrative. What are some of the most insidious narratives that these Controligarchs are concocting?
I mean, sure, that's true. There's been a consolidation of media, not just digital and print media, but of course, the consolidation of virtually every sector. And we get into the banking and all these other things. But I mean, insidious narratives like how about kids can decide whether or not they castrate themselves? That's pretty gruesome, and it's kind of seems pushed everywhere. And if you question a child's wherewithal to consent to a procedure like that, you're labeled a transphobe. You might be even censored off of social media. So that's a pretty insidious one. You see what's happening to Conor McGregor just for what's going on in Ireland. That's pretty insidious that they're actually investigating him criminally for speaking the truth. And then, throughout the pandemic, you just saw everything, like just questioning any level of science. I mean, we can't even talk about it right now on the show, or else you might get your channel in trouble. So, but you couldn't question the mandates. You couldn't question the effectiveness of masks. I mean, with the masks, it was pretty obvious because it was cold when the pandemic started around February, March. And so if you lived in a cold place and you put a mask on your face and you exhaled, you'd see all your breath just pouring out the sides, pouring out the top. I mean, I hope that this isn't like going to get us in trouble for questioning something so obvious as a mask not being able to stop a microscopic virus from getting through it. I think a ping pong ball through a chain link fence was one of the scale examples of it's like trying to use a chain link fence to stop a ping pong ball. I think a virus is actually even smaller than that scale. Just all kinds of stuff like that. You couldn't question anything. Whether it was elections, you can't question elections. I mean, you've always been able to question elections. It's your right as an American to question the fairness and cleanness and security of an election. The one side does it every single time, going back every election cycle ever. If they don't win, they question it and say it's rigged and it's stolen and Russia hacked it or what have you. But all of a sudden now Donald Trump, the leading opposition candidate against Joe Biden, is facing anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years in jail for effectively questioning an election. Those are just some. Everybody's familiar with a lot of these narratives. New narratives that you're going to get fact checked and demonetized and whatever. Is if you just even talk about 15-minute cities, that's a huge priority of the World Economic Forum. Central bank digital currencies, digital IDs. I got a fact check the other day just for saying that Bill Gates is working on a digital ID with the United Nations, which was announced earlier this month with the 50 in 5 initiative, where they want to roll out digital IDs to 50 countries within 5 years. If you just even say like, well, these could be ways to track you, that's kind of what they say. It's actually verbatim what they say is a digital ID is a great way to track your medical records and your medical statuses. That's one of the benefits, according to Bill Gates, is your ability to track things. So all of that and more, I'm sure your listeners are well familiar with the types of narratives that you're not allowed to talk about.
It seems like to me, since the pandemic, that they might have overplayed their hand with the mandates and the lockdowns and the response to this. And I think we're kind of seeing the pushback. We just saw that Argentina elected the first libertarian president in world history, and he also received the most votes ever for an Argentinian president. And then you mentioned the farmers protesting in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands just elected a right-leaning Party for Freedom prime minister. Are these political shifts indicative of a growing disconnect and hatred with the influence of the Controligarchs?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and Klaus Schwab predicted it. A lot of people have heard about the Great Reset, and everybody's heard of Build Back Better. But if you really go in and analyze what Klaus Schwab was talking about when he announced his Great Reset, you got to go watch the full video of him in July of 2020. He says, we need to prepare for an angrier world. He says the world is going to get a lot angrier, and he cites the pandemic, but it's really their response, their top-down, heavy-handed mandates response to the pandemic that has ruined our businesses. In Holland, the Dutch farmers, it was the Agenda 2030 climate net zero type rules that led to the farmer protests. So everybody's getting angrier, absolutely, because of the things that people like Klaus Schwab are forcing down our throats. Now, the question is like the pushback going to be enough? I'm optimistic that we'll be able to stave off this kind of total global totalitarian system. But it makes you kind of wonder, like, why are they so open about it? Why are they so open about things like CBDCs and digital IDs? With all of this pushback, they don't seem to be taking their foot off the gas. They seem to be accelerating it as much as they possibly can. You sort of wonder, like, is it too late? I don't believe that it's too late, but like, why would they broadcast their plans so openly? Usually for decades, they've kind of kept their plans secret, but now they're all out in the open, proudly boasted on World Economic Forum and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation pages. And so hopefully for all of our sake, it's a miscalculation on their part to broadcast these plans, and not that we're 3 years away from like AI upending the economy and getting us all on universal basic income because the jobs are gone.
Do you think that these Controligarchs, is this about control or is this about greed? You mentioned specifically Soros in your book. He can short stocks on the way down, buy them at a very low price, and then make money on the way up. So is this greed, or do they just really hate the plebs and the peasants? I mean, it seems like a lot of these rich people, like Bill Gates, for example, if he was born 300 years earlier, he would just be a king, right? He would be a conqueror. He'd be like Napoleon or something. But in today's day and age, you're Bill Gates, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so power is the ultimate aphrodisiac, as Klaus Schwab's mentor, Henry Kissinger, said. They like power. They like to control things, I mean, just for the sake of it. And you can kind of see that because they've got more money than they couldn't possibly spend their money all in their lifetime. That's why they have to like dump it into their foundations and find all of these initiatives to pour money into. It just so happens that those initiatives do generally enrich them to a greater extent and build their wealth, which is kind of the self-perpetuating system. But with the control, I mean, there's this great quote, it's in the book, an MIT professor, Joseph Wiesenbaum, who sort of psychoanalyzed the big tech guys particularly, and why they do what they do, and why do they think that they can reorganize society, and we have this technocrat streak. And he says it's because the computer programmer is like the god of their world, their digital world. They construct the world that there's like Meta and Facebook or Microsoft. They build this world, and in that world, they can turn the dials and flick the switches and make the system work how they want it to. Well, the problem is they think that they can just export that capability to the real world and turn our dials and switches and make us do what they want us to do, because they really do have, I mean, at the end of the day, you can see it just in countless examples in the book, this God complex, like on steroids, though, whether it's with the gene therapy technologies where Elon Musk has said that this has powerful anti-aging implications, where we'll be able to hack the human body. I mean, the head of Moderna said we can hack. It's in a TED Talk. I mean, these are all direct quotes I'm saying here. Nothing conspiratorial. In a TED Talk says that like this is hacking human biology, and the ultimate goal in a lot of these things is a form of immortality. At least they think so. It's the same thing with the transhumanism and the uploading one's brain to the cloud. Elon Musk claims to have done that. He's got this Neuralink company. There's not any evidence that he's actually, quote, uploaded his brain to the cloud, but he kind of mentioned it on a tweet. And then in all forms of other things, I mean, with the fake meats, it's like, what's wrong with cows? Like, cows have been an excellent source of cows and chicken and pork have all been excellent sources of protein, a pretty efficient way to deliver protein to humans forever. And now they want to like grow it in a lab and make cultured cells of, fake beef in a petri dish, which, by the way, uses more carbon energy to produce the fake lab-grown meats than it does to just grow a cow. They claim it's like green, but it's not green. It's just kind of, I don't know. I think they think it's cool. I mean, Bill Gates, one of the things he's got in the book is this fake breast milk company called BioMilk. I mean, it's like, why are you trying to mess with breast milk, Bill Gates? There's certainly this God complex on steroids that motivates a lot of them.
They want to be able to control the process and everything for profits. Like you're saying, like in the book, where if you have a bunch of independent farms in America versus having one centralized area where you have lab grown meat, like all the money is in like the added value. It's not having the steak, it's turning the steak into other things. And that's what they're trying to do at a completely different level.
Right. All of these guys, they really hate competition. I mean, that's like a through line that connects them all. I mean, Klaus Schwab in the 70s, I had to go read all of his manifestos and stuff. And he wrote this one on what he calls stakeholder capitalism, which sounds nice, so like stakeholders are getting together at the table and we all have a seat. No, we don't all have a seat. The stakeholders, according to Schwab's manifestos, are business leaders like, the Controligarchs, NGO leaders, and government leaders. I mean, when did you get to vote for anything during the pandemic? They don't want anybody to vote for anything. And the other thing that he talks about in these manifestos is the effect, like capitalism makes conducting business unpredictable. Why? Because if you're not making a good product, if you're just dominating the market and giving people crappy products, a competitor can come in and totally upend the market, as these guys have actually done in a lot of ways in their markets. But then once they become the top players in the market, they want to ban the competition. And so cows are the competition, gas-powered vehicles are the competition. And so that's why they want to ban it, is so that they just have total market dominance. And you can see, I mean, the most consolidated, like monopolized industries with just a few players, things like the airline industry or the internet service provider industry or the healthcare industry, where there's only a few options, those are generally the most hated industries. People hate flying on airlines. All of a sudden you're having to pay for a carry-on bag and your leg room gets more and more squished every year as they pack more and more people in to the plane. It's kind of a nightmare to fly, right? It's because there's only 5 people and they know that they can just basically say, well, what are you going to do about it? Like switch to the other airline that also sucks. Same thing with internet service providers. Comcast doesn't care about you. They know that you don't have many options and they can deliver terrible service, and on down the list.
Your book references the World Economic Forum, NATO, the World Health Organization or WHO, and the UN extensively. Which of these organizations is most co-opted and influenced by the Controligarchs? And do you think that we'll see the US giving less money to these organizations? I believe, didn't Donald Trump pull out of the Paris Accord, and I think he was not giving money to WHO when he was in the White House, which is, I think, one of the reasons the elites hated him so much.
Sure. So, I mean, the World Economic Forum, it had this I would say that is driving. I mean, the UN and the World Health Organization, those are all a bunch of bureaucrats. They're kind of the puppets in a lot of ways, like the politicians are the puppets. They get their marching orders from either the private NGOs, things like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or the World Economic Forum, which, I mean, the World Economic Forum dates back to really like 1971, but Klaus Schwab, he's Henry Kissinger's student at Harvard. Henry Kissinger as many people know, is like the godfather of the globalists. And it had this like really sort of secretive but deep and abiding connection to this other organization called the Club of Rome. And the Club of Rome put out this report called Limits to Growth. And this is all talked about extensively in the book. That Limits to Growth book, I mean, if you go back and read it, it is like the same script that like they're using now for climate change. It's like hype up the crisis. The crisis at the time was overpopulation. And then you can get people to do what you want. And that's a central theme of the book is crises. I mean, going from overpopulation to global cooling to global warming to eventually the perfect crisis, climate change. But the thing about climate change is it's not like sufficiently scary. They actually talk about this at the World Economic Forum. The pandemic was perfect because it was actually real and people were dying truly from a virus. So what could be scarier than that? That was why Klaus Schwab called the pandemic. I mean, I don't allege that it was an intentional sort of plandemic or anything, but it certainly was a convenient, in Schwab's word, opportunity to completely upend, reorder society, consolidate market share for mega corporations while shutting small and medium-sized businesses. We're still feeling the effects of the pandemic. You hear people all the time say, oh, like, why do you talk about COVID? COVID's over, pandemic's over. No, the pandemic was a blueprint for the future. And the level of control that the pandemic offered to both the private and the government sector was unprecedented, and they don't want to give that back. You saw that, like, I mean, I'm sure there's still states of emergency declared for the pandemic in some places. I don't think the World Health Organization has ever declared that the pandemic is over. So it's really a blueprint for the future. Regarding their funding, so I would say, by the way, World Economic Forum type, but the NGOs that support it and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation things that are like the largest funders of the World Health Organization, they're definitely steering the ship. Eventually, the UN gets around to like implementing the Sustainable Development Goals or the Agenda 2030 type programs, and then that gets filtered down to the governments, where a government will sign on to like a UN compact on, let's say, the Paris Climate Accords or something. But that all starts like at the top, right from the billionaire and bureaucrats of the World Economic Forum's mouth. Regarding their funding, yeah, it needs to be cut, all of it. I mean, I call it welfare for oligarchs. Why are we giving welfare to people who have more than $1.25 trillion in personal net worth, just like 20 of them? It's crazy. We also have these public-private partnerships where we're like helping fund Bill Gates' nuclear power companies. If Bill Gates has got a good nuclear power company, then he shouldn't need our taxpayer money to build it. This is another theme through the book where like they are experts at socializing their losses, but then privatizing their profits. Both sides of the political spectrum can agree that billionaires don't need our taxpayer funding. And so I think we should cut all the funding to these Controligarch organizations.
You have a chapter, I believe, called The End Game. And in that chapter, you write, quote, "The CCP is the Controligarchs' prototype for a global regime of total population control. The Rockefellers, their wealthy allies, their political grantees like Henry Kissinger and his protege Klaus Schwab, and their ideological kin like Bill Gates, in effect, had a hand in this feat, creating a state-run capitalism powerhouse in a communist country. This is not a secret. They boast about it." End of quote. So what is the end game for these billionaires? And is it really just having a globalized version of the CCP?
I mean, it certainly looks that way. And you see like the way that people like Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab, and there's plenty of quotes in the book where they're praising how China handled the pandemic with its brutal, like, I mean, nobody would deny, except for these Controligarchs, that China had a brutal, authoritarian, tyrannical model for dealing with COVID. I mean, they called it zero COVID, where everybody gets locked down. I talk about it like a puppy massacre. I mean, they were slaughtering people's pets. Now, I'm not saying that Bill Gates wants to kill your dog, but the fact that they were praising China's model shows you where their head's at. And it's not just in COVID. The systems that they're building, whether it's with the CBDC or the digital ID, those are both things that China are working on and using and implementing. The mass surveillance of people and like biometric scanning, and ultimately the social credit score. Now, everything that Bill Gates at least in the tech space with, like I said, the digital ID and CBDC, I mean, you've got officials like from the Federal Reserve. So there are people who are speaking out against CBDCs and saying there's absolutely no reason for a CBDC. Like, it serves no purpose unless you want to be able to completely control and track and trace everything that people are spending their money on and doing, and then effectively having a de facto social credit score. So they're working towards that. Bill Gates has worked with China for decades, his company, Microsoft, and some of his Skype type, ICQ type messengers clients that are on Microsoft. Microsoft cooperates with the CCP to out dissident journalists. This has been reported for a long time. And so then you also see the censorship when China was totally censoring people who were speaking out about COVID and the tyrannical lockdowns and disappearing people and throwing them into vans. Bill Gates, he hedges a little bit and says, well, we don't want a full-blown propaganda department, but we definitely need like the misinformation fact checker. So he's sympathetic to the Chinese approach. He probably doesn't want this book out there. If he could snap his fingers and make it go away, I'm sure he would. And Klaus Schwab, I mean, I talk about how they helped build the model. Klaus Schwab got a Medal of Friendship from the Chinese Communist Party in 2018 for his decades of work developing the Chinese economic system. And so this state-run capitalism, or is what they call it. It's really this amalgamation hybrid of communism and capitalism. When you really dig into what Klaus Schwab's so-called stakeholder capitalism is, it's the state-run capitalism where there's just a few big corporations, all very corporatist and cronies with the ruling class and the government, and everybody else just works for them, and nobody actually gets any of the profits. All of the losses are socialized, and the stakeholders are the elites. They'll never give you a seat at the table. I mean, anybody who thinks that you'll have a seat at the table has not been paying attention very closely.
So would another word for stakeholder capitalism be like corporatism?
Certainly, yeah. Corporatism, fascism. Fascism, according to Mussolini, who would know better than him, is the merger of state with corporate power. And that's what we're seeing. And it's always kind of ironic when the left is shrieking about fascists and fascism and whatnot, because it's really the left-wing billionaires who are merging with the state.
One of your quotes I found interesting when you were talking about China was that you said, quote, Zuckerberg has a strange infatuation with dictator Xi Jinping, keeping Xi's book on his desk and even going so far as to ask the CCP chairman to name his firstborn in Mandarin. And then you also mentioned that there's a summer Davos in China, which has been held annually since 2007. I think most people are familiar with the one held in Switzerland. And you mentioned also how Apple shut off the airdrop feature, and Elon Musk has a lot of factories in China, as does Apple. The connections between China and these Controligarchs, it runs far.
Well, yeah, and it actually goes back a whole lot further. And that's why something I talk with colleagues and friends and people about is when we say that China is our adversary or we need to get tough on China, we really need to define those terms, we and our, because we, the middle and lower classes of America, the non-elites, the non-Controligarchs, have much more in common with your average Chinese peasant than we do with the Controligarchs. And the Controligarchs have much more in common with Xi Jinping and the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party than they do with us. Our objectives are not the same. So there is no we need to get tough on China, because they don't want to get tough on China. And when we talk about decoupling, they don't want to decouple, not even close. They don't consider China an adversary. They don't consider China an enemy. Certainly, they consider China a partner and a friend. Now, that may turn around and bite them in the rear when China, I don't think China's totally on the same page with them and is kind of just maybe playing them. It's unclear. But yeah, the relationships with China run very deep. The Rockefeller family, this blew me away, is the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, first sold its first petroleum products in China in 1880. Over almost 150 years ago, the Rockefellers were moving oil products into China, kerosene for lamps, paraffin wax for candles type stuff, before electricity. And so that's 70 years before the Chinese Communist Party. They've been in there ever since. They're very tight with China. It was David Rockefeller, who's the real globalist grandson of John D. Rockefeller, who he's deeply involved with Council on Foreign Relations and Bilderberg and all these conspiracy organizations or whatever. But David Rockefeller, he went over and met Mao and said, man, the efficiency of these Chinese, there might be some human rights abuses, but gosh, they really can get things done. He's not really praising genocide, but that was what was happening. And after the Tiananmen Square riots, Klaus Schwab had to decide whether or not they were going to keep their outreach to China going. And by the way, Kissinger, who was Schwab's mentor, was famously one of the first people to enter communist China. And I believe he went before Nixon. And same with Rockefeller. They really led the opening up of relations with China because it was a huge business opportunity for them. But these controligarchs all talk about like China's efficiency. Klaus Schwab calls it their ability to, quote, mobilize. They praise this authoritarian way of like basically undemocratic. They like, unelected, unaccountable type systems where you can't do anything about it. That's just a fact. They talk about it pretty openly. And so, after Tiananmen Square, the World Economic Forum was like, well, should we cut off relations? Absolutely not. They kept relations going to appease the Chinese. They've been appeasing the Chinese ever since. And it's a huge problem. That's why I write the final chapter is the end game. They want a system like China has.
So how close do you think the U.S. is to having a Chinese model? Back in the Gilded Age, we basically have right around the same level of inequality now as we did then. And then, of course, they broke that up. Like you mentioned in the book, Standard Oil, I believe, got broken up into 34 different companies. That was back when the Rockefellers were literally massacring workers when they were protesting and all the worker abuses in factories and things like that. And then, of course, in the 1960s, you had a sitting president, JFK, actually get assassinated. So it seems like we've kind of gone down this road before and have been able to course correct. Do you see us course correcting, or do you see us closer to that CCP model?
Well, if you ask like WEF visionary Yuval Noah Harari, and I don't know if you've covered him much, but you really ought to, we ought to play some clips of that guy or watch some clips of Yuval Noah Harari. He's this sort of brain thought leader of the World Economic Forum. Klaus Schwab cites him heavily in his book. Harari says we're headed towards this kind of transhumanist, he doesn't call it dystopian, but it certainly is dystopian world where humans can be hacked and your biology can be upgraded and you brain microchips. And Neuralink, Elon Musk's company, just got FDA approval for human trials. It sounds crazy or like far away future sci-fi type thing. Not at all. Like over 10,000 people have put microchips in their brains and people are willing to do it. I mean, I guess for like the ability to send message psychically or watch VR porn or something. That's where we're headed. And artificial intelligence is everywhere. You always thought, at least I did, AI and the robots and cyborgs and all that. That's just far away. And we'll know when we get there. And we haven't gotten there. No, we're there. And it's everywhere. It's all enveloping. It's coming for your jobs. I don't mean to be like a doom and gloom type guy, but just ask Sam Altman, who would know better than him. He's the ChatGPT open AI guy. He says that people who think that it's not going to wipe out a large portion of the populace's jobs are sorely mistaken. They're gunning for it. They want to replace jobs. So in the same way that, 30 cashiers were replaced by 30 machines with just one cashier overseeing 30 self-checkout lines, that's everything. I mean, there's like AIs that can do the jobs of lawyers better than lawyers can do. There's AIs that can, graphics designers and video editors and a lot of journalists, I guess, unless you're reporting on the Controligarchs. I mean, a lot of people think maybe my job is safe. I hope my job's safe, but you never know. I don't think an AI is going to try to expose its master. So I take solace in that, but no, a lot of people don't do that. So, graphic designers and jobs like that, you can just go type in what you want a graphics for. And it's pretty good right now. Where's it going to be in a year? Every month you kind of see these videos popping up and it's like, wow, that's more and more real. I can't distinguish that. And a lot of people are like, oh, well, this will be great. I mean, Bill Gates just the other day said that this will lead to a 3-day work week. And there's like, r/anti-work on Reddit where they think they're like, oh, well, we're just going to like be able to pursue our passions and maybe I'll finally be able to learn the guitar and I'll take up painting classes and go to culinary school. Nah, they're not going to be paying you so you can go to culinary school. Sam Altman says the solution to this massive job loss that's coming, and estimates range from 40% to 80%, is universal basic income, UBI. And you hear calls growing, we need more UBI. Well, what does Sam Altman say that your UBI will be? He estimates that all adult men and women in America will be able to get $13,500. And you might think $13,500 a month ain't bad. That's a solid 6-figure salary. Nice. No, $13,500 per year. You think things are bad now. What about when you're out of a job and then it's everybody on welfare. And so once it's that, we basically have the Chinese style system. Bill Gates talks about how Medicare, Medicaid, he's commented that there does need to be a government board that can determine who gets healthcare. I mean, if you can't afford to have procedures, it'll be determined whether your life is worth saving or not. It kind of happens. It happens in the UK. And then with the digital ID, with the digital currency, with the vehicles, who Congress just this past month passed this kill switch for every new vehicle after 2026. You're in a system of total control. We're like 2 to 3 years away. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. And so people got to wake up. And I do think they are waking up. And I mentioned earlier, I have hope for the future. But it starts with being informed and informing as many other people as you can.
Yeah, that author you're talking about is the author of the book Sapiens, and he has a book called The 21st Principles in the 21st Century. And you mentioned how he talks about the useless class in that book, The 21st Principles for the 21st Century. He basically says that in years past, they needed the peasant class to do average jobs, but he says now all those average jobs, they can be outsourced to machines, which is why they're the useless class. So not a very happy thought from that author.
He says, what do we do with all these useless people? And the best thing that he can think of is like placating drugs in video games, like either antidepressants or pills, or I guess like more fentanyl would get them out of the way so that the government doesn't have to pay for their living and housing and eating. But no, I mean, that's how these people talk. That's how they think. I mean, he tries to kind of hedge it and couch it in like, well, I'm just warning you or whatever. But I've read his manifestos. I've watched all of his videos, and he's pretty giddy at a lot of times. Like, the useless class will be just on drugs and video games. So Mark Zuckerberg's got you covered with VR and metaverse, and Apple's got a new VR coming. So you'll just be sitting in your pod eating the alternative protein paste, watching VR porn, and that'll be your existence. And if you're lucky. But Yuval Noah Harari, I mean, he, like, one of the really sick things that he says, and he's like very, very happy about it. He says, I can almost quote it verbatim. It's like, COVID was critical because it was what allowed us to normalize total biometrics surveillance. And so that not just monitoring what you're doing and tracking and tracing and contact tracing and getting tested and all this kind of stuff, but actually it sort of normalized this idea that we can track what's going on under your skin. And so this is why he talks about microchipping people, so that it's for your health, of course, but it's really so that they can just be keeping tabs, and all of that data is extremely valuable, just not to mention the controlling aspects of it.
When people talk about the future, they always talk about 1984, but it's really, I feel like, more of Brave New World with hints and flavors of 1984 mixed in.
Yeah, it's yeah, with the Soma feel-good drug. But it's 1984. It's The Matrix. It is Brave New World. It's Equilibrium. It's all Mad Max, I'm sure, coming, all wrapped into one.
Seamus Bruner, in your epilogue, I like the fact that, a lot of people will just write a book and then they never actually add any solutions. They just tell you the problems. But in your epilogue, you highlight 7 legislative fixes, and then you also highlight 7 steps that individuals can take to counteract the Controligarchs' plans. What are a couple of the most important of these fixes that you highlight?
Sure. One of the main reasons I did this book is because these guys are just so far above Congress. So I don't have a ton of hope, but Congress has shown some glimmers of resistance in recent years. Not all that encouraging, but I do say that Congress needs to completely defund the Controligarchs agenda, whether that be, it's crazy that an organization like the World Economic Forum deserves American taxpayer dollars. It absolutely does not. It's like the most well-funded organization in the world by trillion-dollar corporations. So cut that funding right away. But also down the list, cut the funding to all of these globalist organizations that want to subvert American sovereignty. Like the World Health Organization right now is working on this pandemic treaty where the citizens take a back seat to the global health mandates. So defund all of them. And that only requires one house. The House, it has the power of purse. We always hear them talk about it. And then once the, Republicans get the House, they shut up about their power of the purse and they fund the omnibus bills. So we'll see. Hopefully Mike Johnson will cut some funding. That is one thing that you don't have to have all 3 branches of government to do, is cut the funding to the globalist organizations. As far as what you can do, it starts at the very simplest, easiest thing you can do is be informed. If you're listening to this show, you're probably pretty well informed, but you got to spread the word. You've got to evangelize, and you got to get organized at a local level. There's all kinds of organizations. I just saw this. One of the things I wrap up, other interviews with saying that gives me hope is people are craving authenticity. And I say, I had previously said that was just a gut feeling. You see it in the comment sections of AI videos, like, this is creepy, this is weird. You see it with consumers rejecting the fake meats and fake protein companies. It's kind of flopped with consumers, which is why they have to mandate the banning of cows and why Beyond Meats and Impossible Burgers are making their ways into school lunches by force. But the authenticity thing, now we've got the data. Merriam-Webster just made its word of the year authentic. And that's proof that people are waking up. People are not wanting to live in this sort of dystopian hellscape. And that comes from you guys spreading the word and getting organized and meeting up with people in person. A lot of organizations, at the local level that you can help spread the word. All of the solutions, and so this is, if I could sum it up in 2 words, buy local. All of the solutions are local solutions, whether it's from the food and the toxic food and eating chemical-filled fake meat patties. You just buy local. It is more expensive, but it's really important to support your local farmers, support your local small businesses. You got to be watching where you're spending your money. Don't be funding the Controligarchs by giving them your money. And so, the book is available on Amazon. I would prefer you buy it from a local retailer. One of the reasons I wrote the book is because the Amazon monopoly is just so powerful. It's hard to get anything not from Amazon, especially during the pandemic. That was true. But buy local, act local, spreading information locally, just in groups. And, you should probably get familiar with communication channels. I mean, email is a great way, actually, as old as it is and kind of clunky, building up your contact list and spreading the word that way. When the social media companies come to clamp down on you, at least you'll be able to do that, at least for now. So local solutions are the main ones I would recommend for listeners.
Seamus Bruner, author of the book Controligarchs, exposing the billionaire class, their secret deals, and the globalist plot to dominate your lives. Where do you recommend people buy your book? You also are the director of research at the Government Accountability Institute. So where can people find you? Get a hold of your book just before we wrap it up. And then just what's a final thought before you leave?
It's at all retailers, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Amazon. You can go to any of those websites. You can go to controligarchsbook.com, spelled like it sounds, book.com. And I've got, all of the retailers are listed on there. I mean, there's like Powell Books, and there's some options that are better than Amazon. I totally understand Amazon is the cheapest place to buy it. If you do buy it from Amazon, just make sure you cancel your Amazon subscription afterward. The thing that I would recommend to people is just to have faith, have hope. I mean, it's not over yet. We can win. It seems daunting every day, but just keep spreading the word, and you got to be armed with facts. And this book is totally full of facts. And when you come armed with the facts, you find that you can actually break through to some people.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.